So let me welcome you all for the seminar, and let me welcome most sincerely the speakers. If I understand well, there will be 5 speakers. Anja, Nedoluzhko, Michal, Novák, Martin, Popel, Zdeněk, Žabokrtský, and Dan Zeman. And they will inform us about a very fresh project, how the coreference wants to meet or already meets universal dependencies. So I think Anja will be the first, so please, that's your floor.
Thank you for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our ÚFAL seminar series, where we will present today a pilot experiment on harmonizing of 17 coreference datasets for 11 languages. This work has been done by 4 programming researchers, Michal, Novák, Martin, Popel, Zdeněk, Žabokrtský, and Daniel Zeman, and 1 non-programming researcher, myself. I was responsible for theoretical background and comparing and comparative analysis of coreference annotated projects. I will start with a short data introduction, what we are actually going to unify, and then continue with presenting existing coreference data resources and speaking about their variability. Then Michal, Novák will say some words about multilingual aspects and some previous harmonization attempts. Zdeněk will continue with presenting our harmonization scheme and speaking about our collection. Then Martin Popel will speak about API for our data and present 1 case study about how we solve discontinuous markables. And Dan Zeman will speak about inducing linear mentions for trees and will conclude. So let's start with the example. Let's look at some basic examples of coreference. When we say Peter has eaten all apples himself, himself refers to Peter. So 2 mentions, Peter and himself, refer to the same referent. They are coreferential. There is a coreference relations between them. And the first mention is called antecedent and the second mention is called anaphor.
Excuse me, Anja, don't you want to start slide sharing or am I the only one who doesn't see
I didn't.
them?
Wow, sorry. Of course, why didn't you say before? I was totally sure I did. Can you see that?
It's much better now. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. I will just very shortly show you the first slide. This was the outline of our talk. And now I begin with the examples. So the first example is Peter has eaten all apple himself. The first mention is antecedent and the second mention is anaphor. The second example, don't eat the apples which are mine, which is referring is coreferential with the apples. So again, there is a coreferential relations between the apples and which. The next example, this apple is mine, don't eat it. There is a coreference relation between this apple and eat. The anaphoric mention should not be necessarily a pronoun, it can also be a full noun phrase. So in the example number 4, Mary gave people an apple, Steve gave him another one, and Peter took them and left. Peter is coreferential with him and with Peter in the first sentence. So a study of coreference has a long linguistic tradition in Prague, and to say more, not just in Prague, but at our department. So in early 80s, Professors Hajčová, Panevová, and Zgal published a thorough theoretical paper coreference in the grammar and in the text, where they presented a detailed classification and description of coreference relations. And this theoretical tradition has been applied practically in the annotation of coreference relations at the tetragrammatical syntactic level of Prague dependency tree bank and other corpora. So with the years going, we added new texts, new types of new coreference types, new languages. We also added English, but some distinctive features of coreference remained, so of Prague coreference remained. And these features are the distinction of grammatical and textual coreference on one side, and a strong interconnection with syntax. So the Prague coreference is really inseparable from syntax. What do we mean by grammatical and textual coreference? This is this slide. So the first two examples are the examples of grammatical coreference. Now, when we say Peter has eaten all apples himself, the coreference of Peter and himself is absolutely clear, and it is clear from the syntactic structure of the sentence. So the sentence itself gives the information that these mentions are coreferential. And the same situation is the next example. So the relation between relative pronoun which and the apples is also grammatical coreference. So the sentence doesn't give any other possibilities of interpretations. The next two examples are examples of textual coreference. So here the coreference is also clear. So when we say this apple is mine, don't eat it, we definitely know that it refers to this apple, but this is not given by the sentence structure, but by the context. We could theoretically imagine a very strange context where it will refer to something different. It's not probable, but it could happen. So it's not about the sentence structure, but the expected context. And in the fourth example, the situation is the same. So Mary gave Peter an apple, Steve gave him another one. Him is normally coreferential with Peter, but could be referred to another antecedent. So it seems to be easy, but it's far from being so easy. So there is a large variety of different cases. First, for example, in the example number 5, Mary gave Peter an apple, Steve gave him another one, Peter took them and left. Here, them refers to both an apple and another one, and together these two mentions make an antecedent. This is traditionally called split antecedent. In the next example, the identity is not really so identical. So when you say, I didn't like this apple, I bit it off several times and threw it out of the window. What is thrown out of the window is not really identical with the original apple. So it was bitten up 2 times. So it's a little bit kind of less, but still it's in some sense coreferential and identical. But when you did finish the apple, so when you say, I finished my apple and threw the stub out of the window, it's not identical anymore. So the stub is a part of my apple, and this relation is traditionally called bridging or associative anaphora. A little bit from another perspective, anaphoric mention should not definitely refer just to a noun phrase. And in the example number 8, I ate Peter's apple, he will never forgive me for that. That is referring to the whole previous sentence. And this is the case of discourse deixis. There are the cases of bound anaphora, like there are a lot of apples in the bean, each has a worm. In a strict sense, a lot of apples is not coreferential with each. And then there are some rather syntactic cases like apposition and predication. So for example, when we say this red apple is a symbol of happiness, we don't really speak about the identity of red apple and a symbol, but we rather say something about red apple. So we're predicating the apple some new quality. And this is something about between syntax and anaphoric relations and coreference. So there is a variety of cases, and as you can imagine, projects which do annotations of such cases may have different choices what to annotate and what to leave out. But what can be observed at these examples is that the borderline between syntactic relations and coreference relations is quite fuzzy. So some apposition, predications, some types of pronouns really concern both syntactic and coreference relations. And this interconnection leads us to the idea that syntax could be very helpful to make coreference. And put it together with the long syntactic coreference tradition in Prague, we consider that the idea to harmonize coreference resources under the Universal Dependency platform may be very fruitful. So this was one of our why we wanted to make it with universal dependencies. Well, so much for introduction and examples. And now let's look at existing coreference resources and their variability in a little bit more detail. So we know of about 50 data resources annotated with coreference. It's definitely more than we can do in 5 people, so we had to select, and we selected 17. And our criteria was, first of all, data availability, and we also focused a lot on licenses. So we really wanted to be able to publish the resulting data set under the as free license as possible under the LingDat repository. And if it was not possible, we looked for compromises, but it was a very strong preference. And then we wanted it not to be very small, and we wanted it to be interesting. So not just a lot of data sets for English, not just every data set annotated in one annotation tool, so as much diversity as possible. And in this version, we didn't take any resources with languages that we couldn't read. So rating system is Cyrillic or Latin alphabets. The result is 17 data sets included in the harmonization study. There are 13 data sets with 3 licenses that we included in the release. And these are Czech Prague dependency GBank and Czech part of the PCEDT. For English, the Georgetown University multi-layer corpus, Potsdam commentary corpus for German, Democrat for French, Parcours for parallel English and German texts, Ancora for Spanish and Catalan, Polish coreference corpus, Hungarian coreference corpus, Lithuanian and Russian. And for non-free licenses, we harmonized but did not publish 4 more data sets. And these are English ontonodes, the most popular on coreference annotated data sets for coreference resolution experiments. English Arrow, this is the group of Massimo Poesio with very thorough annotation scheme that we wanted to adopt it. Dutch, Korea corpus for Dutch, also with interesting annotation scheme, and the English part of the PCEDT because of the Wall Street Journal texts that we couldn't include in the open release. So it's obvious that these resources will be very diverse. And so from all possible perspectives, so from the domain perspective, from which kind of relations are annotated, what is actually considered to be the annotated mention, so what is the entity that is taking part in the relations, which additional linguistic information resources we have, some such as lemmatization, part of speech tagging, sentence segmentation, tokenization, and so on. And these are all very important criteria and very important information because how we treat it crucially influences the qualitative aspects of the output, harmonization, and actually as the result, the quality of the data. That's why we made a comparative analysis of the resources from all this perspective, or as much as possible from all types of the relations. And we published this analysis in the technical report together with the data release. But well, it's a lot of information. I cannot speak about all of this now. I will just shortly present how the coreference relations are organized, speak about one relation and one slide about mentions, and the rest can be found in the technical report. So the organization of the relation, there are two possibilities, two solutions in the data sets. One is cluster-based grouping of mentions. So coreferential mentions may be grouped in sets in clusters that are co-indexed by the same cluster identifier as is shown here on the picture. So coreferential entities have the same identifier. And the second possibility is link-based grouping, which is referring to one mention, and it's here on the picture. So it is typically a chain in the order of linear precedence of mentions, but sometimes it's tree-shaped, and then it's not totally isomorphic with the cluster-based solution. Cluster-based grouping slightly prevails. You can see here in the table. So this is the common table of all adapted resources. So here you can see the part of open release, and here are the datasets with non-free licenses. And here in the horizontal line are the features. And you can see that cluster-based solution slightly prevails, but we also have a link-based solution in some corpora. And even one corpus includes both solutions, so cluster-based and linked-based. And as for relations, I have chosen the apposition relation, but we actually can take everyone. It's all of the relations were very, very interesting from the comparative point of view. Annotation project differed in many aspects, and it is also linguistically different. But let's look at the appositional construction. Bob, my father-in-law, got married yesterday. So here we can see two kind of pieces of text, Bob and my father-in-law. Both of them refer to the same entity. But if we look at the sentence structure, my father-in-law rather gives some more information to the name. So it rather predicates some new quality to Bob than just co-referring. And this doesn't have really clear-cut boundary with what is coreference and what is just syntactic relation. And that's why existing resources annotated for coreference have many different solutions, at least 6 in our release. So the resource may either totally ignore the relation don't annotated, and this can be done taking into account that this relation can be obtained from syntactic annotation, as we do that for our Czech corpora, or it cannot be obtained from syntactic annotation as it is done for some other corpora. Then apposition may be marked as a special type, and there is also different. It can be done within the coreference annotation, like in English onto notes or also in the arrow corpus, but it can be also marked out of coreference. It can be also included in the span of one mention. So Bob, my father-in-law, is just one mention together, and it can refer back or to the following text as one mention. And this is the decision of Polish coreference corpus and PAR-CorFuL. Or it may be annotated in the same way as identity relation without making any distinction as it is done for Dutch. Well, and here you can see the representation in the table. The apposition is represented as no if it is not included and cannot be taken from syntax. For PAR-corpora in brackets, it means that we didn't annotate it for coreference, but it can be taken from syntax. And other corpora have it somehow annotated and marked that this is apposition. And the same was done for many other relations like predication, split, antecedent, discourse, deixis, and bridging. It's always very interesting. Oh, well, and the last, what I wanted to, from my side, is what is considered to be a mention, what is actually annotated. And here is, there are two perspectives. If we look from the formal, how the mentions are formally represented, they may be represented as linearly, so like a piece of text from left to right. And it may be possibly discontinuous. So some projects may are allowed to put something out. And maybe also possibly may also distinguish a head, syntactic or semantic. If not linear, it may be dependency based when mention representation is defined by its head token, and all its dependencies are considered as a mention, but it can be also quite implicit. And this is what is done for Prague corpora. If we look at the table, we can see it here. So the linear span is marked almost in all adopted resources, except for Prague corpora, where we adopt dependency structure. And a semantic or syntactic head is also marked in many corpora, and in brackets means that we can derive it from syntactic annotation. And from the linguistic point of view, it may be also interesting what is included in the mention. Is it just pronoun? Are these just pronouns? Which kinds of pronouns, or maybe also full noun phrases are annotated for coreference? Are all noun phrases annotated for coreference, or just specific ones, and generic are not annotated? Pronominal adverbs, and another interesting point is zeros. So for many, for some corpora, zero subjects or objects or possessives, as for Hungarian corpus, are important as anaphoric references, so they are also reconstructed and annotated. But as you can see, there are also a lot of corpora that do not do that, because, for example, English doesn't really need it so much. Well, this would be all from my side, and I give the floor to Michal Novák for multilingual presentation and previous work on harmonization. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Please stop here. Okay, great. Can you see the presentation? Can you see the presentation? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. So another aspect of diversity across different corpora, coreference corpora, is how coreference is expressed on the surface, or what means are used, or what linguistic means are used to express it. So here are the examples of English and Czech, or English originals and Czech translations. And in the first example, you can see that while English uses personal pronoun in a subject position, in Czech it is usually unexpressed, also in this case. In English or in Czech, the Czech example here uses the related clause with the relative clause with the relative pronoun, while the English example uses to express the same, it uses the present participle. And in English, here the possessive pronoun is used, and in Czech the reflexive possessive pronoun is used. And there are many cases that no possessive pronoun, neither reflexive nor the common possessive pronoun is used in Czech. That is elided. And in the other example, this is a less common case, but it is often it is also possible that the reflexive pronoun that is dependent to the verb in a sentence, in a Czech sentence, shifts into the to a different position and changes to possessive pronoun dependent on an object of the sentence. So these are the examples of another aspect of variety between across languages, and these examples are from our study with Anya, and we collected, the study was collected on PCEDT, the parallel corpus of English and Czech. And this is a schema of how of correspondences between potentially coreferential expressions. On the top, you can see the English types of expressions. In the bottom, the Czech types. And as you can see, the correspondence is not one-to-one, and the wider the line is, the more frequent it is. So you can see that English central pronouns, mostly the personal pronouns, turn into anaphoric zeros in Czech. And those lines that are ended with ground symbol, it means that these were not aligned in the other language, so they are just skipped or expressed in a different way, which is hard to align. So as you can see, there's a lot of diversity or variety across the corpora that annotate coreference. And in the past, there were several, but not many, harmonization efforts, how to unify or harmonize all those schemas, corpora. And from the wider perspective, we can see any multilingual corpus as a harmonization effort, because you have several languages that, as you could see on the previous examples in Czech and English, can work very differently in terms of coreference. And so you need to come up with a common representation or common schema for these diverse languages. So examples of such corpora were ancora of Spanish and Catalan, ontonals of English, Chinese, and Arabic. Already mentioned PCEDT of Czech and English, pause, parkour or parkourfu. From the narrower perspective, the harmonization effort is merging multiple existing corpora under the same annotation. And from this narrow perspective, not many attempts happened so far. So, and maybe the first, and for the long time, the last one was the SEM-Eval 2010 shared task on coreference resolution in multiple languages, where the organizers created or published under the same scheme 5 corpora in 6 languages, in Spanish, Catalan, Dutch, English, and German and Italian. And in this scheme, they only concentrate or focus on the identity coreference. And this scheme also uses the same format, which I will talk about later, or like on the next slide. And just recently, or from the last year, or maybe from the 2019, there is an initiative of Universal Anaphora led by Massimo Poesio. And this initiative, as you can see from its name, it tries to harmonize and is influenced by the success of the Universal Dependencies. And this involves many members of the coreference community, including us, and our corpus CorefUD is one of the contributions to the discussions about the harmonization. So from the technical point of view, the harmonization, you need to come up with the same format or same representation. And there were several formats that were more or less widely used across several corpora. And in that SEM-Eval 2010 shared task, the organizers decided to represent the coreference here in a conal format. It can be. It is also like called conal 2012 or Semeval 2010 format, and this format became more popular after the conal 2011 and 2012 shared task on coreference resolution, and which set the standard for the representation and evaluation of coreference. And this format is column-based, but only identity coreference is represented here. And the coreference is represented as a last column in an open-close notation. You will see the example on the next slide. So I will continue with another format, which is mmax. This is an XML-based format, and it wasn't aimed only for coreference, but for a broad variety of linguistic phenomena. And it has been adapted or adopted by several corpora of different languages: Araud, English, Polish coreference corpus, Koreaid, Dutch, Potsdam commentary, German, Parker-Felix, Parallel, corpus of English and German. But in fact, this format it's not the same across the corpora. It has numerous variations. So the corpora is different numbers of XML files, different way of how sentence boundaries are captured. There is a diverse set of attributes of mention, and or different ways of how mentions are grouped to clusters. And at ÚFAL we have also one we had one initiative to come up with a universal or representation, which is Prague markup language. It was also it is also XML based, and also aims to a broad variety of linguistic phenomena. But unfortunately, it mostly stayed in Prague or at ÚFAL. It's used rarely outside ÚFAL, and this is PDT and PCDT are the most known representatives of this markup. Okay, so here is the example of the CON 2012 or CON format. This is an excerpt from English OntoNotes. So it's a column based. In the first column, you can see the document ID, and then some. In the third column, there is a position of a word or of the token, and the very last column is open close or the bracketed notation of coreference. So this 12 on the third line means that the I is a mention, and on the mention and it's a mention number 12, and on the there is in the bottom there is a mention from the cluster number 119, which is this SMS. Okay, so it's Zdeněk's turn.
Okay, thank you. So I'll start my screen share. I hope you can see my slides. So if I summarize quickly what has been said, the elementary observations are that there are at least dozens of existing coreference projects and datasets, but each of them is somehow different from all the other ones, and there were some harmonization efforts, but it's not really the case that we could easily run multilingual experiments because, or at least not in a wider scale. If we are lucky, we can do it for Czech and English because there's the Prague Czech English dependency tree bank, but maybe we could find up to 5 other parallel resources for coreference, but that's it basically. So in spite of the fact that huge annotation efforts has been invested into the resources, we can't really exploit them in a multilingual way. So we are trying to create some harmonized collection, and there were 3 main sources of motivation of ours. First, of course, universal dependencies. Then second, as Anya said, the coreference in the Prague, the annotation of coreference in the Prague dependency tree bank has been always considered as a part of deep syntax. So that's also our inspiration. And actually, the initial spin for our activity came from the discussions initiated by Massimo Poesio and others within the so-called Universal Anaphora initiative. So it's all very important, very informal, but we really tried hard to work with the data rather than. What I want to say is that within the Universal Anaphora initiative, the discussions are quite theoretical based, while we tried to go in the bottom-up direction and start from the data. So why do we make it so centered around universal dependencies? I mean, someone could say that coreference is coreference and syntax is syntax, but I think that there are quite a few reasons to try to merge these two worlds. So of course there are pragmatic reasons, like universal dependencies are famous nowadays, so it's a good trademark. And also technically there were numerous decisions done concerning sentence segmentation, tokenization, POS tagging, etc. So we would like to build on these standardization efforts. And last but not least, there are also software tools for the UD format. So these are pragmatic reasons, but I believe that there are also like linguistically motivated theoretical reasons. So first, mentions, the things that are referring to real world entities, are often syntactically meaningful units like constituents or so for example, for reflexivity in Czech, the notion of subject is important. So it seems it makes sense to consider syntax and or dependency and coreference together because of the nature of mentions. Another reason is that some of the coreference relation types are primarily manifested by syntactic means. It could be the case of relative clauses, also reflexive pronouns, apposition, perhaps some kind of predications. It is also some kind of overlap between syntax and coreference. Another reason is that at least in languages like Czech, we simply have to consider zeros, especially prodrops, but there are many other types of them. And you can hardly reconstruct a zero token or node without considering syntax. And there are quite a few other reasons. So it's the choice was not done only because of the pragmatic reasons, but also because of the linguistic ones. But if we take at the evolution of universal dependencies from a rather technical viewpoint, I think that there's an interesting observation to mention. So I think that the evolution of these harmonization efforts in syntax can be traced back at least to 2006 or so. And what I find interesting is that at that time, XML was everywhere around, and also JSON became very popular later. And I would never expect at that time that a simple plain text format would become the winner in any unification effort. But surprisingly, the simple plain text tabular-based kernel format became the winner. So I think that the lesson to learn is that it seems that simplicity matters. Simplicity is more important than flexibility for this kind of cooperation. So, well, one could expect that people will prefer freedom, but it seems that more constraints is having more constraints is more important for getting the momentum with cooperation. So I think that we should pay attention to the format from the very beginning. And our decisions were the following. We decided that we will strictly follow the standards of the CorefUD file format specification, and that we should really produce files that can be technically validated, that they are compliant with the specification. Well, it was quite limiting for us because you know, the format is already specified, and but we have the huge world of coreference, and we have to push it somewhere into the format. And our decision was that, well, there were multiple options, but our decision was that we take the MISC column, it is the 10th column, I guess, in the CorefUD format, and we'll store all the information in the form of attribute equal value pairs. And this is important, we'll store all the information about coreference on the line of the syntactic head of a mention. So this is actually the main connecting point between coreference and dependency syntax in our scheme. So all the important information is stored in the head of each mention. And as Anya said, there are two main options: cluster-based representation of coreference, like you have coindex groups, or length-based, you have pointers following the anaphor antecedent lengths. And we chose the cluster-based because it's slightly, well, one of the reasons is that it's slightly more prevalent. As for other decisions, so we decided to add the annotation in the universal dependencies style, even if no morphological or syntactic information was present in the original data. And in such cases, which was actually the majority of cases, we used UD pipe for parsing the data. The whole pipeline, the whole harmonization pipeline for each resource is fully automatic. So we did not add any manual annotations, even if we have noticed some mistake here and there, but it's important that it can be rerun easily from the beginning. As for the implementation, well, I really can't go into details now, but I would just like to say that we used, for importing the data, we always used the module or the library that seemed to be most efficient one. So it was tricks for some PDT data and plain XML library in Python for Emacs, and there was some Java interface for Ontonodes, and for some of the resources existed already in the CorefUD format. So then our interface for CorefUD named UD API has been used. So like from the technological point of view, the harmonization process, the implementation of the harmonization process was quite diverse. So the harmonization itself is not very harmonized. Another point, as I said, we have to compress all our information into the name attribute or name attribute value pairs in the MISC column, and for each mention we describe the mention span and the cluster which it belongs to, and optionally we can specify split antecedent or bridging relations, or empty type in case of zeros, and some other examples. So let me show some examples. Konkurencia ze strany ministerstva. This is an authentic, well, examples will be from authentic data. So you can see that there is a discontinuous mention because the ... tokens are used only this sentence, but they are not considered a part of the mention. So it can be discontinuous by specifying two intervals of tokens. And we can see that one mention represents the whole, well, these 4 words. And there's another mention referring just to the ministerstva, because it will be referred from some further context. So we have 2 mentions, and one of them is nested in the other. Okay, another example of nested mentions, this time from German. Wenn Sie gegen Gras, Christa Wolf oder Stefan Heim in politischen Angelegenheiten and so on. So we can see that we have 3 names being coordinated, and each of the names is a constitutes a mention of its own, but the whole coreference is also one huge mention. So you can see that because of the Universal Dependencies coordination style, we have 2 mentions being headed by the first name. So just the name itself, Gintergras, or the whole coordination. So that's the second, no, that's this one. So by using this brackets, we can have multiple nodes, multiple mentions being headed in the same node. Well, coreference is not the only relation which we can represent. So now the example is that some technicians managed to do the device replacement during the weekend and on Saturday, blah blah blah. So Saturday is a part of the weekend. So there's a part relation from the Saturday node towards the weekend. Well, as I mentioned, in some languages, 0 mentions are important. So this time it's an example from Hungarian. And well, I will not try to read it in Hungarian, but the translation is roughly as follows. This sheet had to be brought in today and was here for everyone. So it's the sheet, what was here. So you can see that there's a reconstructed 0 node, which is connected with the word for the sheet from the first clause. So we can handle zeros, and we can also handle different other types of information. So a MISC in a MISC column. Okay, I also said that we provide all the datasets with UD style dependencies. I mean annotations. So you can see that sentence segmentation was almost always present in the original resource. So in such cases, we usually keep the sentence boundaries. Tokenization was also almost always present. As for part-of-speech tagging, there are a few different situations. So sometimes it was present in the original data and we kept it, or we converted it somehow to the UD text set, or it was present, but we have rewritten it by the UD pipe result because it was not easy to convert. Okay, and the same holds for lemmatization and syntactic trees. So in some cases, we have reparsed the data even if the information was present because it would be hard to convert it automatically. But it's, I would say, it's a temporary solution in some cases. Okay, now the resulting data set has been released publicly. I mean, the part, the 13 data sets that can be released publicly are published via Lambda, while the other data sets that cannot be released publicly are just kept internally for our own research. And all the datasets already have been divided into train, dev, test sections, or we introduced the division. So this is actually the same listing as Anya has shown. So we have some 13 datasets for 10 languages in the public part that can be downloaded easily, and 4 more datasets in the non-public add-on. Okay, of course, we can already extract various statistics from the data. So this is one of many tables that we produced. Well, just let me pick a few random observations. So as for the number, the average number of mentions being annotated in 1,000 words, surprise, surprise, the Prague dependency tree bank is the winner. Why is that? So there are at least 3 reasons. So first, Czech is a pro language, so there's a need for many reconstructions. Second, there are also many other reconstructions in the case of verbs of control and various generic actors and so on. And fourth, in Czech we don't have determiners, so the denominator is smaller. This should be also considered. Well, I would say that this column shows that it's the resources are roughly comparable, so there's no difference in the order of magnitude. Now, let me have a look at the structure of mentions. So this is the distribution of their lengths, and we can, in some languages in which it is annotated, we can have 0 length mentions. So these are the zeros. You know, I have shown it for Hungarian, but well, again, we have the biggest amount of 0 mentions in the case of Czech. And when we look at the largest mentions, I mean, in the sense of having the biggest number of tokens included in the mention, you can see that the resources that in which the mentions are represented by syntactic means, so either as a constituency node, as a non-terminal, in the case of Ancora, or as in the case of dependency subtree in our tree banks. So in these cases, the linear spans of the mentions are quite long. So like 1 out of 4 mentions in Spanish is 5 tokens or longer. But I would say that this is the consequence of the annotation, not the difference between languages, of course. Okay, as I said, there are many more statistics extracted already, and it's all summarized, including the format description and the survey of the input data. It's all summarized in a technical report, which is available on the web. And I think that's the end of my part. Okay, Martin, if I may ask you to continue.
Yes. So I will now talk about the API for working with these annotations, and it's built in the UDAPI framework. So if you are not familiar with UDAPI, it's similar to Trix, if you are familiar with Trix. And the goal of this toolkit is so that you can work with any data stored in the CorefUD format. The UDAPI supports also other formats, but the primary format for storing the dependency trees and other annotation is CorefUD, and the main goal is to work with Universal Dependencies. So you can use it for querying as an alternative, for example, to PMLTQ, or for printing any statistics as those in this presentation, and for visualization, exporting to some formats like HTML and so on, or text-based visualization of the trees, for converting from different formats, and so on. Of course, also for editing the trees automatically with a code in Python. So we have added 3 classes for working with coreference. So one class is for a mention, and for another for the coreference cluster, and also some helper classes for better support of bridging relations. And we have spent quite some time with making this really fast, especially if you don't need to work with the coreference, or maybe even with any information stored in the MISC column in the CorefUD format. Then it's not loaded at all, or it's loaded only when you need it. So you don't pay it for it when you need it, don't need it. Here is a small example of 3 lines in Python. So you load this convolute file and you can use the method for drawing. Here we don't want to draw the whole tree bank, just the first tree. And you can specify any attributes which you want to see. And it comes with this graphical representation of the dependency tree, maybe rotated 90 degrees to what you expect. And in the MISC column, you see the annotation for coreference. And we plan to add some better even visualizations specialized for coreference. And here is an example of code. So you take the document and all the coreference clusters. You can either approach them by querying each node, whether the node is a part of any cluster, or you can this way ask for all coreference cluster in the document. And for each cluster, you can get all the mentions of that cluster. And for each mention, you can get a list of the words within that cluster. And the words are, again, or nodes in the tree are objects. So you can, for example, get the word form or part of speech tag and so on, dependency relation. And the output of this code is that for each cluster, you see all its mentions, and some mentions or the form of the mention is repeated. So you can see that this 11 times this entity was referred to as Mr. Putin, 2 times as his, and so on. Okay, and now let's go to a study of the discontinuities. So by discontinuity, we mean a linear discontinuity. So that, as you have seen, there are 1 or more tokens in the middle of the mention which are not part of the mention. So it's a so-called gap. You could also define a tree-wise discontinuity, but let's call it non-Nontrilate. So we expect somehow that in the typical case, each mention corresponds to a treelet in the dependency tree. What does it mean, treelet? It's a connected subgraph of the dependency tree. It's a slightly different term than subtree. A subtree is defined in graph theory as a node and all its descendants. So in this case, if you choose the node lidi, then the subtree would be nejlepší lidi pro své cíle. So all the whole like phrase up to the leaves in the tree. But here in the, and this is from the PDT, so only nejlepší lidi was annotated as the mention, and pro své cíle is not part of that mention. So Dan Zeman will talk about automatic detection of these spans, but I wanted to stress out that this is still considered a treelet, although it's not a whole subtree. So if it's a non-treelet, it means that there are multiple roots, basically multiple trees. And so there is a question whether we want to annotate somehow all such roots of or heads of all the parts of the mention. So far, we still choose only one of the nodes as the head. And we should note that in some tree banks or in some of our resources, the parsing is automatic by UDPipe, so it may be wrong. So this may be spurious non-treelet. Here is some kind of classification of the discontinuities, both the linear discontinuities and non-treelet. So it could be caused by non-projectivities, and I will show a few examples later. There is quite a big portion of cases caused by shared modifiers, or in general by coordinations. And there can be also parenthetical construction. So as Zdeněk showed, the 3 dots, for example. But some of the cases which are discontinuous by definition could be considered spurious. So for example, there is some punctuation excluded from the mention, but maybe it should be included. Maybe it's an error on our side of the harmonization or conversion. There are also sometimes empty nodes which are in the gap, which cause the gap. So maybe we should also either include the empty node or move it somewhere else. It's somehow artificial decision where to place the empty node word or device. And there could be also mentions which contain multiple sentences which we cannot represent currently. So this can also cause some of the strange things. So now basic statistics. So here are the resources, datasets sorted by the percentage of mentions which are discontinuous linearly. So it should be once again noted that this is not influenced, this is the linear, so this is not influenced by the parsing, but it, in case of the datasets where the span was not annotated and we just guess it with heuristic rules, it could be influenced by this heuristic rules. And let's see a more detailed table. So here is in the first column, this is the percentage of mentions which are continuous and Nontrilate. So this is what we expect. Some of the continuous mention linearly are non-continuous in the tree. So these are Nontrilate continuous mention. This is what I wanted to say. And as for the linear discontinuous mention, again, we can distinguish the Nontrilate and non-Nontrilate cases. And in the last three columns, I try to detect what is the reason for the linear discontinuity. So if we sum up those three numbers, it should be the same as summation of those two numbers. So sometimes it's the empty node within the gap. So this is somehow spurious, perhaps. Sometimes it's related to coordination. So far, I only detected that there is a conjunct label, doctoral label in one of the in dimension. And there are other cases which still need to be detected. And few examples. So in English arrow, this is the shared modifier, both of these examples. So information about stock purchases by corporate insiders and sales by corporate insiders. So actually by corporate insiders is the shared modifier. And if we want to annotate only the first conjunct stock purchases by corporate insiders, it's necessarily discontinuous. So I think we are slightly beyond the schedule, so I will go now quickly. In this German example, it's non-projective because the German grammar says that this verb needs to go to the end of clause, but this relative clause, it's actually part of the this mention. And again, there are also shared modifiers. In Polish here we can see the parenthetical case, so this is not the explanation less frequently, it's not part of the mention, and there are some other cases. If you're interested in this, maybe we can get to that in the discussion. And one more slide from me. We can take the advantage of having both dependencies and coreference annotation in the same format. So we can easily ask, for example, what's the part of speech of the hat? And here we see that mostly these are nominal coreference or pronoun or propronouns, determiners, and so on. But we can also see that there are quite large differences between the tree banks or coreference resources. So this is something to further study. Maybe some of these are errors in the conversion or harmonization and so on. So that's all from me.
Well, so I hope you see the slides again. And I will now, in the final part of the talk, finally show you some trees together with coreference annotation, and I will do so on the material from the Prague dependency tree bank, because also to show you what it actually means to convert the existing annotation to the UD style. And as most of you know, the Prague dependency tree bank has multiple layers of annotation. One of them is the tectogrammatical layer, which is where actually the coreference annotation lives. So we definitely have to use this. But there is also the analytical or surface syntactic layer, which so far was the only source of information for any conversion of Czech data from Prague dependency tree bank to UD. So we only took the syntax from the analytical layer, and now it's the first time that we also look at the tectogrammatical layer, but still the bulk comes from the A trees. Now, as you've heard already, the assumption, at least in the Prague view of coreference, is that you can represent the mention using its head word, head node, and it's understood as spanning the complete subtree in the tectogrammatical tree for that mention. So that is something that does not necessarily hold when you project the annotation to universal dependencies, because the tree is different, the dependency structure has been transformed. So what used to be a subtree is not necessarily a subtree in the target representation. We will see an example. But before we do so, I should also remind you that in universal dependencies, there are also sort of two layers of annotation. One of them is the basic tree, but we actually have to be looking at the enhanced graph, because it's the only place where you can have empty nodes, which by now you know we need them. But there are also reentrances and even cycles, so it's no longer a tree. It's really a generic graph. So that also raises the question what a subtree of a node should mean there if it's not a tree, and how should we define a head, and so on. These are actually still sort of open questions, but we actually at least use some heuristics to do it. So here's the first example. Hlídka vyrušila muže, který se vloupal do restaurace. The petrol disturbed a man who broke into a restaurant. So there is one long span, and it's a complete subtree. So it's headed by the word man, muže, but it includes all its dependents, including the relative clause, který se vloupal do restaurace. So that also means that it includes a smaller mention, který, which actually is coreferential with the larger one. So we can have nested mentions where even the smaller inner mention is coreferential with the whole thing. That's legitimate here. But now when we convert it to UD, and in this diagram, I'm still looking just at the basic tree in UD. We can see that there are gaps in the mention, and that's because in the tectogrammatical tree, only content words have their own nodes. So for the function words here, for the reflexive se and for the preposition do, they don't appear to be part of the mention, because when we go over all these nodes in the subtree, we don't see them. But fortunately, it is possible to track down the function words in the tectogrammatical tree, because they are as attributes of nodes there. So there are links to the lower layers of annotation, and we can find out that these words actually are somewhat associated with the content words, with the verb and the word restaurant. So we can include them in the span so that it's not spuriously discontinuous. There is still one more gap, and there's this comma here, because punctuation is not even treated as a function word. But for this, we can use a heuristic. So as long as it would be only punctuation that would cause the mention to be discontinuous, we will include it in the mention. And if we now finally look at the enhanced graph instead of the basic tree, there are not too many changes, but one of them is significant, and that's the highlighted relation here, which actually demonstrates that especially with relative clauses, you can have cycles in the enhanced representation in UD. There is this link going from muže to vloupal, And there is another relation going back from Vloupal to muže. So that's why it's actually not so clear that muže should be considered the head of the mention in any sense. Now, my second example is about the empty nodes. Just to demonstrate that we need them. So this is actually a sentence from the same document. He met the policeman there for the second time, and he is not represented overtly on the surface, because in Czech you can just infer it from the morphology of the verb, but in the tetragrammatical layer it has to be reconstructed as the actant of the valency frame, and because it also participates in coreference, which goes over the sentence boundary. So it's coreferential with something in the previous sentence, and for that reason it's important for us. It's a mention. So we have to reconstruct it somehow. And here is the analytical tree from the same sentence from PDT, which so far was the only basis for us to convert the syntax to UD. So in the resulting UD structure, most of this has come from the analytical tree. But for the coreference annotation, we also want to reconstruct the empty node he. So there are multiple issues connected to that. We should place it somehow in the syntactic structure, which so far we only do heuristically. Essentially, attach it to the node that corresponds to its parent in the T tree, and we have to put it somewhere in the linear sequence of the words. So to avoid non-projectivities, we insert it immediately before the parent verb. Here between tam and setkal, but again, there would be multiple possibilities where to place it, and this does not necessarily guarantee that you will have no discontinuous mentions on the surface. So, as Martin said, there could be potential improvements along this axis. There's one more example of empty nodes that I have here, which is for control verb constructions, which so far we treat them as any other empty node or generated node in T3 that participates in coreference, but in fact to work in the spirit of the enhanced representation in UD, this kind of constructions should actually be collapsed to have just one node, which would represent both mentions, the blue one and the purple one here, and the syntactic relations would be collapsed to the same place, which would be doable as long as it's grammatical coreference inside one sentence. My next example is one with coordination, which already was sort of mentioned in the previous parts of the talk. So here is dělení kvót, division of quotas between Czech Republic and Slovakia. Quote is one mention that's in the sentence. There's actually no coreference within this sentence, but there are multiple coreference relations going outside the sentence to previous sentences, and that's why we need to be able to annotate some of the mentions of the entities here. So quote is one of them. Then there is the coordination, Czech Republic and Slovakia. And it's a complete subtree in the tetragrammatical layer, which is headed by the conjunction. And in UD, it is still a complete subtree, even though it's now headed by republic. There are also individual mentions for the conjuncts. So na Českou republiku is the first conjunct, and it's again a subtree here, even though it's not as large as the whole coordination. But then the second conjunct actually is discontinuous linearly, because from the T3 we learned that the preposition is shared by the Czech Republic and Slovakia, so it will be included in the mention down here as well, but it's distant from Slovakia. So that's one of the legitimate ways how we can get discontinuous mentions on the in the target representation. I will now, in the interest of time, skip this final example, but I'll be happy to get back to it during discussion. That's essentially demonstrates what we have, what issues we have, which could create spurious discontinuities, and I'll get to the conclusions. So essentially, we've analyzed the variability of coreference annotations in a wide range of resources and designed the common scheme and converted the 17 resources to this scheme, which represents 11 languages. And the releasable part of it has been released. So that means that it's now ready for experiments, even though we believe that it still can be improved, but already it's possible to run coreference experiments with that. In the future, we hope to fix some of the imperfections that we have pointed out, and we also would like to extend the harmonization and possibly converge with the other standards being designed by the people in the Universal Anaphora community. That's all I wanted to say. Here is again the URL where you can find additional details. And thank you for the attention. We are now ready to take questions.